Dear colleagues, I would now like to proceed with the consideration of the outcome of Singapore based on the report of the Universal Periodic Review Working Group of Singapore. Thank you. As contained in documents A/HRC 32/17 and A/HRC 32/17 addendum 1. This report, together with the additional information that will now be provided by Singapore, will constitute the outcome of the review and shall be adopted by the Council through a standardized decision. I now have the pleasure to give the floor to our colleague, His Excellency Mr. Pho Kok Yui, Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary and Permanent Representative of Singapore to the United Nations Office at Geneva, to present the additional information on the review. Your Excellency, dear friend, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Honorable Council members, distinguished representatives of observer states, members of civil society, especially Singapore civil society who have made the long journey to Geneva, a very good afternoon to all of you. At the outset, let me first extend our heartfelt thanks to the Secretariat and to our Troika. Your support and counsel throughout this entire process has been the most helpful to us. I would also like to thank the many states and members of civil society for sharing their thoughts on Singapore's policies and their recommendations to us. We are appreciative of the warm words of encouragement of many delegations and the endorsement of our track record, social policies, and pragmatic approach in realizing human rights during the 24th UPR Working Group session in January. Mr. President, I would like to take some time today to briefly explain our approach to review the recommendations we received, highlight some new developments, and outline our approach going forward. Our starting point and our long-standing goal has always been to build a strong and progressive nation, where our citizens can lead meaningful and happy lives in a fair and inclusive society. We are fully committed to the protection and promotion of the human rights of our citizens. We treasure and will protect every Singaporean against any threat, regardless of race, language, religion, social identity, or sexual orientation. Our delegation leader to the UPR Working Group in January, Ambassador Chan Heng Chee, had explained in some detail the circumstances and factors that shaped Singapore's pragmatic and outcomes-based approach towards protecting and promoting human rights of our citizens. We believe that this broad approach towards governance remains relevant as ever, even as we recognize that our society is changing and the forces of globalization are leading to greater income and social stratification. We still need to manage the enduring challenges of dealing with primordial and visceral forces of race, language, and religion in our diverse society. This entails seeking accommodation among the competing rights of the individuals who make up the nation and the interests of society as a whole. We firmly apply the rule of law, which we believe is a fundamental precondition to protect the human rights and freedoms of Singaporeans as enshrined in the Constitution, and to uphold the core principles of fairness, secularism, meritocracy, and multiracialism. It is with these principles in mind that our Inter-Ministerial Committee on Human Rights has carefully reviewed the 236 recommendations that we received at the 24th UPR Working Group session. We support 116 recommendations, support in part 9 recommendations, and note 111 recommendations. Broadly speaking, we support recommendations that complement our ongoing efforts to build a fair and inclusive society. In many cases, we are already implementing policies to strengthen social safety nets and enhance social harmony in areas such as support for lower-income Singaporeans, education, healthcare, rights of women and children, protecting migrant workers, caring for the elderly and persons with disabilities. But we do not support recommendations that are predicated on unfounded assertions, inaccurate assumptions, or erroneous information. There are a handful of such recommendations related to the freedom of expression and freedom of peaceful assembly and association. In addition, we cannot implement recommendations that are not appropriate in our national context on issues concerning capital punishment, the LGBT community, and national security. We have already comprehensively explained our reasons for this during our working group session and in our addendum. About a quarter of the recommendations that we do not support in full relate to the ratification of international human rights treaties. Singapore takes our treaty obligations seriously. We engage seriously with the relevant treaty bodies, review our reservations where appropriate, and welcome shared learning on implementing human rights. Our policy is to actively review our position in respect to human rights treaties. However, in order not to prejudge the outcome of this review process, we do not commit ourselves to accede to or ratify treaties ahead of review. Mr. President, I would like to pause now to listen to the views of member states and civil society before delivering my final remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the statement. And before giving the floor to the member and observer states for their comments on the outcome of the review, I would like to inform you that the speaking time has been brought to 1 minute and 30 seconds for all states. I will now open the floor to members and observer states for their comments on the outcome of the review, and I give the floor to Cuba to begin with.
Thank you, President. We warmly welcome the delegation of Singapore, led by the ambassador, our great friend. We welcome the fact that since the last review in 2011, Singapore has implemented numerous progressive policies to improve social protection and safeguard social harmony. We acknowledge the ongoing efforts of Singapore to build a fair and inclusive society through specific policies in areas such as support for low-income Singaporeans or assistance to enable citizens to age in dignity. We also acknowledge the limitations faced by Singapore as a small state. Its multiracial society requires the adoption of a pragmatic approach when it comes to upholding the human rights of its citizens, and as such we encourage Singapore fully to implement and in a pragmatic way the recommendations accepted under this second UPR cycle. Lastly, we invite Singapore to continue to take a future-oriented approach involving the government as a whole as well as society as a whole in order to protect the fundamental rights of its citizens, preserving common space for all Singaporeans. I thank you.
Thank you very much. And I give the floor to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. My delegation welcomes the delegation of the Republic of Singapore and commends for their sincere participation in the UPR process. My delegation takes note of the report of the working group A/HRC/32/17 and is encouraged by Singapore's commitments to the promotion and protection of human rights after the 24th session of the UPR working group held this last January. The interactive dialogue with the delegation of Singapore during the working group was an opportunity to get to know with each other on Singapore's experience for furtherance of human rights by realizing social harmony and achieving socio-economic progress. We welcome Singapore's acceptance of many of the recommendations as demonstration of its will to make further efforts in the field of human rights. My delegation wishes Singapore all the best in its future endeavor for the promotion and protection of human rights and recommends the adoption of the report on the UPR of the Republic of Singapore by this Council. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call on Egypt.
President, my delegation extends a warm welcome to the delegation of Singapore. During the review session, we commended the significant efforts exerted by the government of Singapore, including in areas of social protection, interfaith dialogue, human development, healthcare, and promoting the rights of older persons. We are pleased to learn that Singapore accepted 125 recommendations stemming from the review process. It is also encouraging that Singapore decided to accept recommendations presented by Egypt on combating trafficking in persons, especially women and children, providing protection for the family and realizing the right to work, as well as acceptance to consider the ratification of the option protocol of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Singapore is a country where multiculturalism and sustainable human development have achieved significant strides. Egypt once again commends Singapore for being a success story from the developing world. We congratulate the government of Singapore for concluding a successful universal periodic review, and due to Singapore's active endeavors in South-South cooperation, we encourage Singapore to share its experience in relation to preparing for, participating at, and following up on the UPR with small island developing states. Egypt wishes the government and people of Singapore further prosperity and welfare. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'll give the floor to Ethiopia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ethiopia warmly welcomes the delegation of Singapore and thanks the delegation for the beneficial and informative national report and the oral update. We note with appreciation Singapore for accepting our recommendations to continue preserving social harmony as a diverse cultural and linguistic nation, to build a fair, inclusive society, intensify fighting radicalization and terrorism at its early stage, to sustain the enjoyment of human rights and the basic freedoms of all Singaporeans. We commend Singapore for the continued commitment to progress and improve human rights and efforts to build a fair and inclusive society. We encourage Singapore to take all necessary measures for the implementation of the accepted recommendations during its second UPR cycle. Finally, Mr. President, Ethiopia supports the adoption of UPR outcome report of Singapore. We wish all the best to the delegation of Singapore and its constructive engagement with Human Rights Council. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. And now give the floor to Qatar.
President, Mr. Vice President, the delegation of the State of Qatar welcomes the delegation of Singapore led by His Excellency, the Permanent Representative, and thanks them for their constructive engagement with the UPR mechanism of the Human Rights Council and for the comprehensive update provided before us today. My delegation noted that Singapore has accepted a great number of recommendations to build a fair and thus inclusive society, in particular those about maintaining radical and religious harmony, as well as combating human trafficking. We are also pleased to note that the two recommendations made by Qatar enjoy the support of Singapore, and we look forward to their prompt implementation. Mr. Vice President, my delegation encourages Singapore to maintain its commitment to provide good education, healthcare and employment opportunities to persons with disabilities, and to provide quality and affordable medical services for all under the Healthcare 2020 Master Plan. We further commend the government's vision to create a nation for all ages and the launch of its action plan in August 2015 to create a conducive workplace for all ages, especially the aging population. Mr. Vice President, the State of Qatar recommends the adoption of the UPR outcomes of Singapore by the Human Rights Council and wishes the government of Singapore all the success in the implementation of the accepted recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll give the floor to India.
India warmly welcomes the delegation of Singapore and thanks them for a comprehensive presentation highlighting their position to the recommendations received during their second UPR in January 2016. We commend the government of Singapore for the constructive manner in which it participated in the UPR mechanism. The review reflected the high participation of peer countries with as many as 113 delegations making statements and 236 recommendations addressed to Singapore. It's encouraging to note that Singapore has accepted as many as 125 of these recommendations. India trusts that Singapore will further intensify its efforts to implement the recommendations accepted by it in the coming years. While recommending the adoption of the report on its UPR, we congratulate Singapore for its successful review and wish it all the best in implementing accepted recommendations. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you very much. And I call on Indonesia.
Mr. Vice President, my delegation extends our appreciation to the delegation of Singapore, a fellow ASEAN member, for its constructive engagement in the second UPR cycle. Indonesia welcomes Singapore's continuous commitment in advancing the promotion and protection of human rights while upholding fair and inclusive social harmony through implementing measures to promote the rights of women, children and persons with disabilities, as well as in preserving racial and religious harmony. Mr. Vice President, Indonesia expresses its appreciation to Singapore for ratifying the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. and the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child on the sale of children, child prostitution, and child pornography. Meanwhile, our recommendation on the accession of the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of Their Families and the Convention Against Torture was noted. Therefore, Indonesia encouraged Singapore to continue taking necessary steps towards the accession of those conventions. Finally, Indonesia supports the Council adoption of the report of the Working Group on the UPR of Singapore, and we wish the people and government of Singapore success in implementing all the accepted recommendations. I thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I give the floor to the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Mr. Vice President, my delegation welcomes the delegation of Singapore and commends their active participation in the UPR mechanism. We also appreciate the Singapore's delegation for detailed information provided to this session with regard to the implementation of accepted recommendations. Mr. Vice President, the Islamic Republic of Iran acknowledges the efforts made and the steps taken by Singapore with regard to implementing policies since its last review in 2011 to enhance social protection and preserve social harmony. We appreciate Singapore's continuous efforts to build a fair and inclusive society through concrete policies in areas such as supporting low-income people and adopting an approach to realize the human rights of its citizens. We also thank Singapore for accepting our recommendations in a constructive manner. In conclusion, we wish the government of Singapore every success in implementing of accepted recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'll give the floor to Kyrgyzstan.
Thank you. Mr. Vice President, Kyrgyzstan welcomes the delegation of Singapore and thanks for information that was provided on the recommendations received during the second UPR cycle. We welcome the fact that Singapore has implemented many progressive policies since its last review to enhance social protection and preserve social harmony. We note with appreciation that Singapore accepted numerous recommendations, including our recommendations to complete the process of accession to the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child on the sale of children, and to take additional measures to protect child victims of violence. We believe that children should be protected properly, and implementation of these recommendations will contribute to this process. In conclusion, we wish Singapore all the best in the implementation of accepted recommendations. I thank you.
Thank you very much, and I give the floor to the Lao People's Democratic Republic.
Mr. Vice President, as an ASEAN fellow member, the Lao delegation welcomes the distinguished delegation of the Republic of Singapore and would like to thank for the additional presentation on the promotion and protection of human rights in the country. My delegation notes with appreciation that Singapore has implemented many progressive policies since its last UPR review to enhance social protection and preserve social harmony. My delegation recognizes that Singapore is a small state and multi-racial society that needs to adopt a pragmatic approach to realize the human rights of its citizens. We encourage Singapore to fully implement its accepted recommendation and to continue to take a forward-looking whole of government and whole of society approach to protect the fundamental rights of its citizens while preserving common space for Singaporeans. We therefore recommend that the UPR report of Singapore be adopted by the Council. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I now call on Malaysia.
Malaysia joins earlier speakers in thanking the delegation of Singapore for its intervention today and the presentation of its national report on 27 January 2016, which we have listened to with much interest. We congratulate the delegation of Singapore for the comprehensive information provided during the interactive dialogue session on its efforts through various policies and programs towards the realization of human rights for her people. In particular, we note the efforts made in implementing of policies that improve the social protection and provide assistance to the low-income segment of its society, including in health and education. We also note that Malaysia's recommendation relating to the promotion of awareness programs on HIV/AIDS in addressing the stigma faced by patients has been duly considered and accepted by Singapore. We encourage Singapore to consider favorably the establishment of a national human rights institution in the future, with the views to expand the avenues for
partnership between the government and its citizens in the promotion and protection human rights in the country. In concluding, Mr. Vice President, my delegation would like to recommend the adoption of the report on the UPR of Singapore. We wish Singapore the best in implementing the accepted recommendations. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, and I'll give the floor to the Maldives.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The Maldives would like to warmly welcome the delegation from Singapore. We appreciate the constructive engagement Singapore had with the working group. The Maldives notes that during the interactive dialogue, 113 delegations engaged in the review. Of the 236 recommendations received, we are pleased that the Government of Singapore supports 116 recommendations. The Maldives is further pleased to have been part of the Troika of Singapore and the constructive engagement and partnership they showed. We appreciate that Singapore has accepted the recommendations made by the Maldives. We are greatly encouraged by the country's commitment to provide quality education, health and employment opportunities to persons with disabilities, and on the promotion of gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls in Singapore. The Maldives commends Singapore on the efforts to build a fair and inclusive society. We also encourage Singapore to fully implement its recommendations in a pragmatic way. We urge the country to continue in taking a forward-looking approach to protecting the fundamental rights of its citizens while preserving the common space for all Singaporeans. We wish Singapore every success in the implementation of the recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you. Et j'ai maintenant le plaisir de donner la parole au Maroc.
I recognize Morocco. Thank you, Vice President. This delegation congratulates Singapore on its interaction with Council during the presentation and discussion of its national report pursuant to the second UPR cycle. We note with appreciation the attention paid to recommendations made during this review process, and we particularly thank the delegation from Singapore for accepting the two recommendations presented by Morocco. We welcome the reiterated commitment of the Singaporean authorities to protect and promote human rights. In particular, we are satisfied to note major efforts that have been made on a continuous basis by Singapore to ensure a fair and inclusive society via pragmatic policies to implement human rights for all citizens, given the inherent constraints of a multiracial society. And we would like to encourage Singapore to continue these efforts and wish them every success in implementing the recommendations they have accepted. We support the adoption of this report pursuant to the second UPR cycle for Singapore. Thank you, sir.
We have a little time for the spillover list. I now call on Myanmar to take the floor.
Mr. Vice President, my delegation warmly welcomes the delegation of Singapore and thanks them for providing additional information on its UPR outcomes report. We commend Singapore's active and constructive participation in the UPR mechanism. We are pleased to note that Singapore has implemented policies to enhance social protection and preserve social harmony since its review in the first cycle. We also welcome Singapore's continuous efforts to build a fair and inclusive society through concrete policies in various sectors. We would like to recommend that the UPR Working Group's report on Singapore be adopted. As a fellow member of the ASEAN, we wish Singapore every success in implementing the accepted recommendations. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you very much. Now give the floor to Oman.
سعادة الرئيس إنه لمن السرور أن أتقدم.
Mr. Vice President, it is an honor to welcome the head of the delegation of Singapore and the accompanying delegation. I should like to appreciate the presentation presented today by the delegation of Singapore, which reflected the serious commitment of Singapore to protect and promote human rights in line with its international commitments. Mr. Vice President, the acceptance of Singapore of many recommendations, including the recommendations presented by my country, testifies to the government's continued commitment to promote human rights on the basis of the relevant international instruments. Hence, we recommend the adoption of the UPR's outcome by the Council, wishing Singapore every success and prosperity. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. I now invite Pakistan to the
Mr. Vice President, we welcome the delegation of Singapore and thank them for providing update on the recommendations received. We appreciate the decision of Government of Singapore to support 116 recommendations and support in Part 9 recommendations that were made during the UPR working group session, including those recommendations which were made by my delegation. We wish them success in implementation of the accepted recommendations. We welcome the fact that Singapore has implemented many progressive policies since its last review in 2011 to enhance social protection and preserve social harmony. In this regard, we appreciate Singapore's continuous efforts to build a fair and inclusive society through concrete policies in areas such as supporting low-income groups, providing universal health coverage, and lifelong learning program. We urge Singapore to continue to take a forward-looking, whole-of-the-government and whole-of-society approach to protecting of the fundamental rights of its citizens while preserving the common space for all the Singaporeans. In conclusion, my delegation recommends the Council to adopt the UPR outcomes of Singapore by consensus. I thank you.
Thank you very much. And we can accommodate the last speaker, the Philippines, please.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The Philippines congratulates Singapore for its constructive and active participation in the UPR process. We acknowledge the significant achievements made by the government of Singapore in advancing the protection of human rights, particularly in the elimination of human trafficking, protection of the rights of older persons, and the promotion of migrant workers' rights. We laud Singapore for recently signing the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination and for signifying its strong intention to ratify the said convention in 2017. We look forward to Singapore's continued commitment to engage with bilateral and regional partners to further advance human rights. We wish Singapore well, and we call on members of the Council to support the adoption of the report of the Working Group on the UPR of Singapore. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And this was unfortunately the last speaker we could accommodate as per established practice. The statements which could not be delivered due to time constraints will be posted on the HRC extranet. I will now give the floor to the other stakeholders to make their general comments on the outcome, and I start with the International Service for Human Rights.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The International Service for Human Rights is pleased to be joined in this room by a range of national-level organizations and human rights defenders from Singapore. We are encouraged by their participation and welcome the voices of defenders on the ground as a testament, as the Delegation of Singapore has noted in its response, to the value of the UPR process in building opportunities for dialogue between government and civil society as to how to fully realize all human rights for all those living in Singapore. In this regard, we would urge the Government of Singapore to ensure that the Interministerial Committee on Human Rights is truly independent, both accountable to and inclusive of civil society. We remain concerned about the challenges that face individuals and organizations who seek to publicly discuss dissenting views. First, laws and regulations that prevent anonymous private donations or that prevent some organizations, including those working on human rights, from accessing foreign funding should be reviewed to ensure that they do not create barriers to full participation and are compatible with international law. Second, access to information is a critical tool for civil society. The lack of a legal framework in the country to permit regular, credible information to be accessed by civil society groups working in relation to a range of issues, from social and economic rights to due process and capital punishment, also constitutes a practical barrier to their work. Finally, we are concerned about the harassment of defenders, including those cooperating with the UN. Teo Solong, a longtime activist in the country, as well as a well-known blogger, are currently facing court charges filed by the Elections Department, merely for expressing political opinions online. In recent weeks, their offices and homes have been searched and their personal and professional electronic devices confiscated. We echo the views of local actors. This behavior is an example of official efforts to encroach upon the work of civil society. In light of accepted recommendations from France and New Zealand, we would urge Singapore and other interested states to pay particular attention to implementation of recommendations linked to freedom of expression, both online and off. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you very much. And I'll call on the International Commission of Jurists.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The International Commission of Jurists appreciates the recommendations made in the report on the Universal Periodic Review of Singapore regarding the death penalty and the right to freedom of opinion and expression. Despite more than 30 recommendations to establish a moratorium and abolish the death penalty, and despite repeated calls of the General Assembly for a global moratorium, Singapore maintains its intention to continue to carry out executions. Indeed, it carried out its most recent execution of a Mr. Khao Jia-bing just over a month ago. The ICJ urges Singapore to abolish the death penalty. There is no proof that the death penalty deters crime at a greater rate than other forms of punishment. The imposition of the death penalty violates the right to life and the absolute prohibition of torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. During the previous cycle, Singapore had accepted recommendations to ensure the enjoyment of the right to freedom of expression and to protect bloggers and activists from persecution and harassment. In this cycle, Singapore affirmed that no one had been prosecuted for criticizing the government or its policies. It supported a few more general recommendations regarding freedom of opinion and expression, but failed to acknowledge the problem of unjustified restrictions in particular cases and did not accept the more precise recommendations on these issues. In mid-2013, tighter restrictions on online expression were implemented. Between 2014 and 2015, at least 3 bloggers were prosecuted for expressing their political opinions in a manner that should have been fully protected by freedom of expression. Similar problems continue today. The ICJ calls on Singapore to review its position on the relevant recommendations and to refrain from further unjustified infringements of freedom of expression. I thank you.
Thank you very much. I now invite the International Federation for Human Rights Leagues to take the floor.
Mr. Vice President, we welcome the Singapore government's commitment to ratify the ICET and the OPCRCSC. However, we're extremely disappointed that it continues to refuse ratification of other internationally accepted human rights instruments, notably the ICCPR, the ICESCR, and the CAT. The Singapore's claim that it is substantially in compliance with the objectives of international human rights treaties is unfounded. People exercising their rights to freedom of expression face ongoing threats. Last year, a teenager was jailed for publishing a political video. A few weeks ago, a number of bloggers, editors and publishers of independent online media were subjected to intense police investigation for allegedly breaching electoral advertising regulations. Police searched their homes, seized their equipment, and archived their communications in totality. These procedures are wholly disproportionate and are calculated measures to intimidate and cast a chilling pall over civic participation. Beyond the facade of legality, Singapore continues to violate international human rights standards, curtailing citizens' rights to freedom of opinion, expression, and peaceful assembly. Without an independent way of verifying the government's claim about compliance, it is critical that a national human rights institution be established immediately in accordance with the Paris Principles. Prolonged detentions without judicial review under the Internal Security Act and the Criminal Law Temporary Provisions Act continue with no transparency over the numbers being detained. Executions often take place without adequate warning given to the prisoners or their families. We regret that the government rejected the recommendations that called for the abolition of the death penalty and corporal punishment. Repeated calls to establish a minimum wage have also been ignored. Clearly, decades of policies aimed at uplifting the poorest segment of the population have not been successful. Almost a quarter of Singaporeans still live in relative poverty. Thank you.
Thank you. And now invite the Franciscans International to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Franciscan International welcomes the adoption of the outcomes of the UPR Singapore. We commend Singapore's effort in combating trafficking, in particular through the ratification of Palermo Protocol in 2015. This implementation of protocol is a step forward to guarantee the protection and rehabilitation of the victims of trafficking in person, especially for women and children. We also welcome the acceptance of the recommendations on trafficking in person. However, we would like to express our concern on the reluctance of the government of Singapore to guarantee the full protection and enjoyment of the human rights of migrant workers as stipulated in Employment Act and in Work Injury Compensation Act. Therefore, in the process of the implementation of the UPR recommendations, we recommend the government of Singapore to consider the following: ensure the prosecutions and punishment of individuals involved in trafficking and provide further protection and rehabilitation mechanisms for victims; improve the transparency of the hiring process for foreign workers with particular attention paid to the entertainment and labor sectors where there is allegations of trafficking cases; redefine enforcement regulations on trafficking to coincide with the provisions of the Criminal Procedures Code of Singapore. I thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'll call on the International Lesbian and Gay Association.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. This statement is delivered in consultation with two Singapore NGOs, Ugachaga and Pink Dot, that work on the subject of sexual orientation and gender identity. Singapore received and noted all 13 SOGI-related recommendations on LGBT human rights. 11 of these recommendations specifically refer to the decriminalization of consensual same-sex activity between consenting adult males, Section 377A of the Penal Code. We are disappointed that the government continues to deny the existence of institutionalized discrimination perpetuated by this section. In response, Singapore government maintained its position that this legislation is not proactively enforced. It added that the Prime Minister has previously stated it was better to accept the legal untidiness and ambiguity of leaving the law as it was. In fact, we would like to highlight that this has direct consequences for LGBT human rights in Singapore. Discrimination, media guidelines and censorship, refusal to register and formally recognize LGBT organizations, lack of appropriate support and sexuality education for LGBT youth, lack of healthcare and social services to address the needs of LGBT persons, workplace discrimination towards LGBT persons. Sadly, since the UPR, prejudice towards Singapore LGBT community has increased. In February, a local TV station censored a segment of a program in which President Obama thanked celebrity Ellen DeGeneres for advancing the LGBT rights. In June, a same-sex kiss in the musical Les Miserables was also censored by Singapore government. The government has additionally restricted local subsidiaries of multinational companies from expressing support for LGBT events and programs in Singapore, a move that has further narrowed outreach and support as well as stigmatized affirmation for the LGBT community. We urge the Singapore government to repeal Section 377A. We also seek ongoing engagement with the government to address and resolve the key areas highlighted in our report. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. And now call on the Asian Forum for Human Rights and Development.
Mr. Vice President, Forum Asia makes this statement in association with SIONI. We are alarmed that Singapore has rejected nearly half of the 236 recommendations it received. This negative precedence for the UPR is a disturbing indication of the country's unwillingness to work with international human rights processes. Those rejected including key recommendations on freedom of expression, assembly and association. Existing legal restrictions on these rights far exceed permissible under international human rights law. We call on the state to review all laws and policies that impose undue restrictions. We regret that the Singapore government has merely noted recommendations on censorship of LGBT content in the media and the continual decriminalization of sex between consenting men under Section 377A. Despite reassurances that 377A is not proactively enforced, the state appears to conveniently ignore the cascading and intersectional effects of this law that encourages discrimination by the state. The claim that LGBT media content is allowed as long as guidelines are followed is a fallacy. Guidelines prevent all positive or neutral portrayals of LGBT people, even when it includes comments or TV related to history and social change on other countries. In reality, only stigmatization of LGBT people is permitted. Although the state has been quick to cite the annual Pride event Pink Dot as evidence of tolerance and inclusiveness, on 7 June 2016, the Ministry of Home Affairs announced restrictions on foreign sponsorship to this event. We welcome the statement of Ministry of Home Affairs that everyone will be protected against violence regardless of sexual orientation. We note that this remains as lip service as long as the state retains laws that promote violence and discrimination against LGBT people. We call on the government to take concrete steps to decriminalize and remove all policies that discriminate against LGBT persons living in Singapore. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call on Action Canada for Population and Development.
Thank you, Mr. President. Action Canada made this statement in collaboration with Kaleidoscope Human Rights Foundation and the Sexual Rights Initiative. We welcome the Singaporean government willingness to engage to the UPR process. During this review, Singapore received a large number of recommendations calling for the reform of the existing laws that criminalize homosexuality, including the Article 377A of the Singaporean Penal Code, which criminalizes acts of so-called gross indecency between men, including sodomy. We regret, however, that all these recommendations were noted and the government used its earlier explanation that this legislation is not proactively enforced, that Singapore is firmly opposed to discrimination and harassment and does not decriminalize against LGBT peoples to ensure that this law still remains. However, in addition to this discriminatory law, other forms of discrimination against LGBTI people remains. Examples include the requirement of individuals to declare their sexual orientation when applying to the civil service, and the classification by sexual orientation in the admission process of the military, which is followed by assignment of discriminatory duties. This law has been enforced since colonial times, and despite of heated debate in Parliament almost 1 decade ago, it remains in place. Discrimination is a clear example of human rights violations. We therefore urge the government of Singapore to urgently consider repealing the Section 377A as this provision clearly reinforces negative views toward LGBTI people, perpetuates discrimination, and acts as a mechanism to restrict LGBT individuals from full enjoyment of their human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now invite International Fellowship of Reconciliation. Then I turn to Human Rights Watch.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The major human rights issues raised in the 2016 UPR session on Singapore were a continuation of many concerns raised and yet still unresolved since Singapore's first UPR review in 2011. We received very few answers on when, if ever, these concerns will be addressed. Numerous states, for example, raised Singapore's continued use of the death penalty and called for at least a moratorium on capital punishment. Singapore instead defended the abhorrent practice and remains out of step with the broad international consensus to abolish capital punishment as an inherently cruel and inhumane punishment. The May 2016 execution of Malaysian Jabung Hao highlighted Singapore's indifference to these global concerns. Many states raised Singapore's discrimination against LGBT people and violations of their rights to privacy under Penal Code Article 377A, which criminalizes consensual same-sex relations between men. The government did not directly address these concerns, but claimed Singaporean society considered the issue to be, quote, too controversial. Meanwhile, earlier this month, the Minister of Home Affairs warned international companies to stop supporting the annual LGBT Pride and Solidarity Festival, Pink Dot. The government offered few commitments to address serious concerns raised about severe restrictions on fundamental rights such as freedom of expression, association, and peaceful assembly. Singapore's record on ratifying international human rights conventions remains dismal, having only ratified 3 core rights conventions and 1 optional protocol. It has not ratified either the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights or the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Singapore's claims that it first needs to bring its national laws into conformity with these treaties are belied by the fact that it has taken no significant steps to advance a rights protection agenda by reforming its laws. Singapore has long put forward arguments about Asian values promoted by the late Prime Minister as an alternative to international human rights protections. Yet Singaporeans deserve and are entitled to the same rights protections as everyone else. Thank you.
Thank you. And now invite Association of Women for Action and Research.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Women's rights are not sufficiently promoted in Singapore. Women's representation in political decision-making is wholly inadequate when 19 of 20 full cabinet members are men. We call for explicit constitutional protection against sex and gender discrimination. We welcome the possible repeal of marital immunity for rape. We urge that its abolition is total and unqualified for both rape and the offence of sexual penetration of a minor under the age of 16. We call on the state to proactively investigate and address why sexual violence is chronically underreported. We urge an end to all forms of state-sanctioned discrimination against single parents. Unmarried parents, overwhelmingly women, are barred from purchasing public housing before the age of 35 and face discriminatory terms of access. For divorced mothers, prohibitive conditions on public rental housing, like a 30-month debarment after sale of the matrimonial property and an unrealistic income ceiling, cause impoverishment and housing instability. We call for clear, inclusive, equal policies to ensure access to housing. The arbitrary process of petitioning parliamentarians in individual cases is a wholly inadequate substitute. We call on the state to show respect for the right to family life and the rights of the child by publishing clear, transparent criteria for migrant spouses of Singapore citizens to get permanent residence and the right to work. Current arbitrary and opaque processes penalize low-income migrant women who can be deported if their spouses abandon them or are imprisoned. We urge in particular that migrant women with citizen children be given a clear and unambiguous right to remain with their children in Singapore. We urge that the fundamental labour protections of the Employment Act be extended to live-in domestic workers. Under current measures, 6 in 10 have no weekly day off. Only half are compensated for this, typically with sums below Employment Act standards. There are widespread reports of employer abuse, including overwork and food deprivation. We urge an end to this shameful devaluation of care and domestic labour. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now invite the Singapore Council of Women Organizations.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I represent the Singapore Council of Women's Organizations, SCWO, which is the National Coordinating Council of 60 women organizations in Singapore. We acknowledge the Singapore government's engagement with SCWO and civil society during the UPR process and welcome its commitment and support of recommendations with respect to an aging society, rights of women and children, trafficking in persons and labor rights, and look forward to a transparent mechanism for monitoring progress in the future. We wish to highlight the intersectional issues of aging women in Singapore and their social protection and security. Singapore has a significant female aging population. Older women are more likely to live in poverty stemming from increased life expectancy, higher medical costs, inadequate health care, and low or no retirement savings. Older women are dependent on their families for financial assistance, but women without children or widowed women are more vulnerable and more likely to turn to public assistance. There is no state-funded minimum pension scheme, but Singaporeans are dependent on the Central Provident Fund for their retirement funding. SCPF is primarily funded by both employer and employee contributions. Older women are more likely to have having been homemakers or informal workers are disadvantaged, having neither or no reduced income. Singapore needs to ensure that all forms of family are well supported and that families are not expected to bear the responsibility of social protection alone. We commend the Singapore government's gender-neutral civil support scheme and pioneer package and the intended enactment of the Vulnerable Adults Act in 2016. But we ask that initiatives be considered for greater empowerment of able but aged women to help them to be more self-sufficient and self-reliant and not just look at interventionist policies when they become vulnerable. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you very much. And I invite now Amnesty International to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Amnesty International deeply regrets Singapore's decision to resume executions despite the initial progress in reviewing the Misuse of Drugs Act 2012 and the Penal Code Act 2012 with a view to establishing a moratorium on executions as recommended to Singapore during its first review in 2011. On 20 May 2016, Koh Jia Bing, a Malaysian national, was executed in cruel haste just hours after his final appeal had been dismissed. Koh Jia Bing had been convicted of murder in 2010 and sentenced to death. In 2012, following the review of the mandatory death penalty laws, his death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. However, in January 2015, the Court of Appeal reimposed the death penalty in a 3-2 split decision. Amnesty International opposes the death penalty in all cases without exception and calls on Singapore to immediately re-establish a moratorium on executions with a view to abolishing the death penalty as recommended by many countries during its second review. Opposition activists, bloggers and human rights defenders in Singapore continue to face political repression, reprisals and intimidation. In 2015, Amos Yee, a 16-year-old blogger, was sentenced to 4 years imprisonment after he uploaded a video and cartoon criticizing late Prime Minister Lee. Amos Yee currently faces 6 more charges for wounding the religious feelings of Muslims and Christians by posting further comments and videos online. In this context, we are concerned about Singapore's rejection of recommendations to review existing legislation in order to enhance the enjoyment of the rights to freedom of expression, association and peaceful assembly. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you very much. And this exhausts our speakers list of civil society organizations. I would now like to turn again to the delegation of Singapore, but before we do that, allow me to know that based on the information provided, out of 236 recommendations received, 116 enjoy your support, while 119 recommendations are noted. Additional clarification had been provided on one recommendation, indicating which part of its recommendation was supported and which part was not. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Phu Koc Yui for his concluding remarks. You have the floor, Ambassador.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I have listened very carefully to the comments and views of member states and members of civil society. I thank them for their feedback and constructive suggestions. I would like to say a few words to address a few issues raised by members of civil society earlier on recent developments in Singapore. On the case of Mr. Koh Jia-beng, our Attorney General's Chambers had explained comprehensively in their press statement of 25th of May 2016 why the Court of Appeal had dismissed multiple last-minute applications by Mr. Jia-beng's lawyers, who had no new arguments and appeared to be just trying to delay the execution. We had also explained our policy on the death penalty extensively during the UPR working group and in our national report. For the cases involving alleged cooling day offences and new offences allegedly committed by Mr. Amos Yee, it is inappropriate for us to comment further as investigations are ongoing. On the issue of foreign sponsorships for Pink Dot, our Ministry of Home Affairs had explained in its press statement of 7 June 2016 that our government's position has been that foreign entities should not interfere in our domestic politics and domestic issues, especially political issues or controversial social issues with political overtones. In the context of LGBT issues, this applies to events that advocate as well as those that oppose LGBT issues and causes. These are political, social and moral choices for Singaporeans to decide for ourselves. Mr. Vice President, I want to begin my concluding remarks by referring to some thoughtful words by High Commissioner for Human Rights, Zaid Ra'ad Al Hussein, during his interactive dialogue with Member States at the 31st regular session of the Human Rights Council in March this year. The High Commissioner said, and I quote, "I am disturbed by a widespread practice of what could be termed human rights window dressing. The ratification of treaties and agreements and acceptance of recommendations stemming from human rights mechanisms are not in themselves human rights achievements. There needs to be follow-up and real change to bring greater freedoms and dignity to the people. Unless consequential at the level of the rights of the individual, the rights we do will remain bureaucratic or even theatre. Human rights obligations should not be a tick-the-box exercise designed only to boost a country's international image." End of quote. Mr. Vice President, we fully agree with the High Commissioner. We are not into human rights window dressing. We do not view governance as a tick-the-box PR exercise, and we certainly do not want the government's work and continual efforts to be labelled as theatre. Our goal is to ensure that our policies and programs continue to produce good outcomes for our citizens and to surmount the challenges that we face today and in the future. The future of work, a rapidly aging society, terrorism, meeting the aspirations of our own citizens, maintaining our social cohesion, and sustaining a virtuous cycle of good politics and good policies. While Singapore may not be party to a number of human rights treaties, our policies are already fully or largely consistent with their objectives. By many international indices, Singapore is ranked well, largely because of our effective policy outcomes. We are 11th on the UN's 2015 Human Development Index, 9th in the 2015 Rule of Law Index, 13th on the 2015 Gender Inequality Index, 2nd in Bloomberg's 2015 ranking of the most efficient healthcare systems. Singapore has one of the lowest crime rates in the world and one of the lowest recorded rates of drug abuse. Our approach has worked for us and benefited Singaporeans and foreign friends who visit us or make Singapore their home. Mr. Vice President, all societies will have to find their own way forward and become future ready. It is an imperative given the volatility, rapid change, and complexity due to globalization. We too know we have to adapt our policies and test new ideas so that they remain relevant in the ever-changing social, economic, and political circumstances. In Singapore, we have implemented major policies and programs in recent years to ensure that we continue to be economically competitive while remaining an inclusive society. Let me cite a few examples. We are currently embarking on a journey to create the world's first smart nation, a nation where all Singaporeans live productive, meaningful, and fulfilled lives enabled by technology, and embracing technology and innovation to create the jobs of the future for Singaporeans. To prepare for a future where 1 in 4 Singaporeans are over 65 years old by 2030, we launched a $3 billion action plan for successful aging in February this year. This action plan adopts a whole-of-government and whole-of-society approach to chart our way forward for Singaporeans to age well, with dignity, and to lead fulfilling lives. To prepare Singaporeans for a more competitive and dynamic economic landscape, we are transforming our learning culture, both for the young and working adults, to emphasize the mastery of skills and lifelong learning. We launched the Skills Future movement in 2015 and will spend over $1 billion a year from 2015 to 2020 on initiatives to support lifelong learning. We implemented new policies to enhance social protection for our citizens, in particular the most vulnerable groups, to ensure social mobility and to provide more assistance for older Singaporeans. And we're doing this at a time when many societies around the world are confronting and grappling with rising inequality due to the increasing pace of globalization and technological changes. These progressive social policies, which we had outlined in our national report, include MediShield Life, Enabling Master Plan for Persons with Disabilities, the Pioneer Generation Package, and the Enhanced Workfare Income Supplement. Mr. Vice President, some of the policies I cited earlier could well be the first of their kind around the world, but we are fully aware that our principles of governance, the way we care for our citizens, protect human rights, and preserve our social harmony, may also not conform to how other societies have organized themselves. We therefore believe that every country should be given a time and space to deal with its own development and advance human rights in its own way, taking into account its unique and evolving social and cultural context. Mr. Vice President, Singapore will continue to support and participate in the UPR process in a constructive manner. At home, we will continue to consult widely and conduct regular exchanges with our citizens and civil society to ensure that our policies address their hopes, concerns, and aspirations for the future. We will also work with our partners to ensure that the UPR remains relevant and useful to states in its third cycle. In our view, the UPR process is not just about reviewing how well each state has done. It is also an opportunity for states to share their best practices and learn from each other in the promotion and protection of the rights of their citizens. I hope that we were also able to provide better appreciation of Singapore's unique circumstances and challenges and how we are working to overcome them. Last year, Singapore celebrated the 50th anniversary of our independence, SG50 as we called it. 50 years is but a blink of an eye in the life of nations, but we are already looking forward to SG100. We are determined to work together as a people to forge a unique sense of national identity and a pragmatic way forward on economic and social development to keep Singapore special and exceptional. In closing, let me once again express our sincere gratitude to you, Mr. Vice President, the members of our Troika, and to the states and civil society that have participated in this session. Finally, our very special thanks goes to the Secretariat and the translators that have worked so hard to support our work. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for this presentation and the fruitful participation of Singapore in the whole UPR process. I think your final remark shed an additional light on the many efforts that Singapore is doing to create a good environment for the human beings in the state. May I now propose that the Council adopts the decision on the outcome of the Universal Periodic Review of Singapore as it appears on the screen, a text with which you are familiar. I see no objection. The decision is adopted. We will briefly suspend the meeting before proceeding with the continuation of the general debate under item 5 of our agenda. Thank you very much.